Hey everybody, welcome back to Foreign Post. I'm Steve Susans. You know, a lot of times we think of international development as starving children or building hospitals or building schools, but there are many aspects to development that you might not have heard of. One of them is anti-corruption. There's a number of organizations around the world that look at anti-corruption, but one in particular is called Transparency International. They've been around since 1993, and they put out what's called the Corruption Perceptions Index. That was started in 1995, and it's been an annual event ever since. They look at a lot of different things, from government abuse to bribery to corruption in countries and different individuals, organizations, and that index has really become a standard. So recently we sat down with Max Heywood, who's the policy director for Transparency International, and he spoke with Rue Owen, our correspondent in Europe, and here's their conversation.
Hello folks, and welcome to the Secretariat of Transparency International in Berlin, Germany. Today for the Foreign Post podcast, we'll be talking to Max Heywood, who is Head of Policy at TI. Now, I've been very familiar with TI's work in its lustrous 25-year career. I understand it as a non-governmental organization, non-profit, who fights against corruption, promotes transparency, mainly through the use of advocacy, pressure on governments, and some high-profile media publications. The one that I'm most familiar with is the Corruption Perceptions Index, always makes the press, which basically rates 180 countries in terms of perception of public sector corruption. But TI has some other great publications out there. There's the Global Corruption Barometer, which is essentially a worldwide survey, and some other great ones. I recently really enjoyed the Effective-O-Meter, which was based on the outcomes of the Financial Action Task Force. This is obviously of interest to folks watching the Foreign Post podcast, because in the developing world, you see millions and millions of dollars go to aid projects, and the need to track that money, to have accountability, is absolutely crucial. Because if you have the best intentions in the world, if the money's getting into the wrong hands, if it's not going to the right people, or if it funds effects, indirect effects that are actually negative to the local population, then that's a problem. So how did you come to work almost a decade for TI? You know, what's your background? What brought you to this part?
Well, I guess we could start by going way back. So I was born in the UK, grew up in Argentina. And growing up in Argentina was just before the big financial crisis that happened in 2001. And leading up to that, there was quite a bit of issues around just general governance and corruption and the whole collapse of general institutions. So I guess that was my prime driver. I was a student at the time. So that led me to a master's in public policy, sort of to try to understand, and also I studied economics, to try and understand, what had happened in my country at the time. And that is what basically led to TI. So I finished my master's degree in public policy, and I came over here and I began as an assistant, and that's how I got to where we are today.
So when we think about a food program, for example, or a shelter for refugees, those are physical, tangible outcomes that we can look at in development agencies. But with something like corruption and transparency, that's a lot more abstract, if you like. I mean, how do you get a hold on that and handle that?
Well, there's several ways, in fact. It's quite interesting, because this debate was very, very, it was a very hot topic in the beginning of Transparency International's history. So 25 years ago, the story goes, there wasn't much awareness about corruption itself and how big a problem it was. But what's interesting is that since then, there's a lot more awareness, not just of corruption as a concept, but also of its consequences. And just to give you a couple of examples, the Global Corruption Barometer that you mentioned, if you ask citizens around the world how often they themselves have paid a bribe, on average, there are countries where 1 in 3 people have paid a bribe in the 2 years previous. So they've had direct experience of having to deal with corruption. It's not just a perception for them or an abstract concept, it's something that they've had to deal with. And the other way of thinking about it is about the cost of corruption, which you can see in very visible ways in some cases, which is around, for example, a highway that is built and is never finished, a bridge that is never finished, hospitals sometimes collapsing from bad construction, which was linked to corruption in the construction process. And so these are the things that really bring home the cost of corruption to citizens. And also what we've seen in recent years is people actually going out on the streets and marching against corruption. So you can see in many countries in Eastern Europe or in Latin America, you can see people marching on the streets with signs saying, you know, stop corruption, or we've had enough of corruption. So it's become a very, very visible concept, if you will.
How do you measure that? I mean, surely perceptions of corruptions must differ even country to country, if not from city to city.
Yeah, of course. The thing is that just because something can't be measured doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. So, for example, of course, you can measure people's perceptions of corruptions or different surveys, but you can also just do studies around, you know, the amount of money that is spent and the amount of physical objects that are built at the end of that process. So there are very different ways of getting at the actual costs of corruption. Even if you can't measure the corruption itself, which is of course very, very difficult because by definition it's hidden, there are many different ways in which we can look at the costs of corruption, and this is what ultimately really matters. You know, if corruption was maybe really large but it had no consequences or cost for anyone whatsoever, then maybe it wouldn't be such a big deal. But what matters for us is really the costs of corruption, what it means for citizens in their everyday lives, which is becoming increasingly clear in many different ways.
So what are the big showcase projects that TI has at the moment? What are the ones that you're particularly proud of?
Yeah, I think the one that immediately comes to mind is we have a team working with journalists in actually helping them to and working with them on corruption cases. And the way it works is that you may remember almost 3 years ago now, there was the Panama Papers. So this big revelation, data leaks about the offshore world, many powerful people involved in hiding their assets in offshore locations. And at the time, that for us was a game changer in the sense that suddenly opened lots of doors. So we started to think, how could we work with journalists in a more sort of ongoing, in an ongoing way, and cooperating with them in an ongoing way. So you have this really, really nice project with journalists where they actually let us know slightly in advance about stories that are coming out, and that allows us to prepare our campaigns and to be able to explain to people why this matters, and to prepare just the materials that we're going to also be using for our advocacy and for our campaigns, to say, look, this case shows why what we're asking for example, more transparency in government, why it matters. So that's one of the projects that comes to mind as, you know, one of the most innovative ones we've had in recent years.
I mean, corruption for me is obviously a problem that just does not go away. From my limited experience in the development world in places like Afghanistan and Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Central Asia just generally, I saw a lot of well-meaning schemes that went wrong, or were just open to vulnerability for corruption. You know, I'm thinking things like cash for cash schemes, these being weapons caches at this time, where people would hand in weapons that they had dug up in their garden that are 100 years old, or in more malicious cases would actually plant them on their neighbors and cause trouble that way. And the very nature of the fact that cash was being used and it wasn't trackable really added to that problem. Yeah.
So I think there's one of the things that's going on with these examples is that one of the things we've learned is that corruption cannot be tackled in isolation. So we've seen some of these initiatives of trying to tackle corruption in a particular sector, a particular town, you know, one particular process. And what we've seen, not just at Transparency International, but this has become quite a broad consensus around in the community of people working on this, is that you have to look at it as a systemic issue, meaning that there have to be a whole range of institutions actually doing their jobs, and there has to be enough of a political consensus to let those institutions do their jobs. So even something perhaps as boring on the surface of it as the National Audit Office, you know, it has to control where the money is spent, plays a fundamental role, and often people don't think about that in the first instance, that, you know, the National Audit Office that is checking how money is spent and the public procurement goes to the people it should go to, plays a fundamental role in anti-corruption, right? And linked to that also, the media plays a fundamental role. That's another part which has been recognized for quite a while, but is only now, I think, really coming into play more strongly, in terms of that without an independent media, it's very hard to tackle corruption. And in fact, it goes the other way around. When you have a corrupt context, you often see that there's a crackdown on the media, precisely because the corrupt networks are trying to stop those who could detect them. So you quite often see proactive attempts to stop the media from doing their jobs, precisely because they're a threat to corrupt networks. So these are some of the things that have to be happening to stop corruption, right?
That's fascinating. I hadn't thought about how important a free media is to fighting corruption, and obviously there are massive examples of that we've seen with with scandals. Fake news is the kind of casual term we use to it, maybe a lazy term. What kind of role has new technology played in increasing or even hindering transparency? I'm thinking about the different ways that people receive their media, but I'm also thinking about access to the banking system, the fact that more people have access to the banking system through their mobile phones, for example, or that there are technologies like blockchain, which are more accountable step by step. Then on the other hand, you have technologies like Bitcoin, which are by their nature anonymous. I mean, how has new technology helped or hindered transparency?
Yes, I think there's, I guess in one word, it's potential. In the sense that there's huge potential in many of these technology, developments. It's just that we haven't seen them consistently realized yet. So for example, we do hear a lot about blockchain and its being potential for the future, etc. But it's very hard to yet find actual case studies where that has been proven to be the case. And there's a risk here, which is that this discussion about technology can lead us to sort of the magic bullet syndrome, which distracts from the political drivers, which is what still needs to be, is essential, actually, the political will and the pressure on decision makers to actually put in place legislation that should have been put in place years ago. Because we have to remember there are many countries in the world, including in the developed world, in Europe, where basic measures of anti-corruption in legislation, for example, having an independent, well-resourced supervisory authority for your financial sector, just to give you an example, have not yet been put in place effectively. So until you have those bits of the puzzle in place, technology is not going to be able to fix those. So in a way, we still would like to focus on the basic nuts and bolts that still need to be put in place, as well as talking, of course, about the potential of technology, right?
And who's responsible for putting those into place?
So basically, I guess the key actor here is, of course, national governments, right? And a lot of what we do, working with our partners in countries, so we have a network of partners in 100 countries around the world, we call them national chapters, is basically strategizing and thinking about how can we influence national governments to do what they know has to be done. Because the basic nuts and bolts of how to deal with corruption are pretty clear, at least how to make corruption a lot more difficult. So the trick is to find ways to put pressure on governments, not just from citizens and from local media, but also internationally. Through, for example, when countries are trying to get into the EU, there's often standards that they have to meet. So that's an opportunity to try and press them to improve their systems. And so there are various ways in which we can pressure national governments to actually do the right thing, right?
And of course, corruption is not limited to the developing world. We're seeing massive corruption scandals at the moment in Canada, in Romania at the same time. Talking about your work with journalists, I know that TI worked with the excellent Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project on money laundering in the EU, where dirty money was using EU banks as a point of access essentially to the single market.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to ask you is, you yourself wrote about the G20 being too slow to follow up on their anti-corruption promises. How are so-called developed countries, the Western world, if you like, how are they stepping up to transparency, or are they not?
Yeah. So that's been, I think, one of the biggest changes and the most welcome changes in the last 10, 15 years, is that it's become really clear now that corruption is a global issue and that developed countries are playing a role in that. So for example, for every big corruption case you see in a developing country, you see that the proceeds are almost always stashed somewhere in a developed country. So the key, measure or the key aspect of a large corruption scheme in the developing world is to get the money out of the country into somewhere safe. And somewhere safe usually means a country with a strong banking system, with strong institutions, that is also not too strict on where the money came from, for example. So we're very proud to be working with the journalists. We were talking about that before. That's exactly the project I was talking about. And it's through that kind of research and those stories that there's starting to be more and more understanding of the role of developed countries in facilitating, not only that there are also corruption issues and problems with transparency in some developed countries, or in all developed countries to some extent, but the most important perhaps aspect from a global perspective is the facilitation of the flows of corruption and the proceeds of corruption that go from developing countries to developed countries. That, I think, is the biggest shift that has happened in recent years. That is really, really great that at least it's being understood. Now we have to tackle it, of course.
We're talking right now on a global level, but Transparency International for me is interesting is that you have over 100 local chapters. How do they work with you? How do they work together? And do they have any impact on what I would call local day-to-day corruption? The policeman who takes bribes, the mother who has to pay to get access to hospitals?
Yeah, so this is the work that a lot of our chapters are doing. So basically trying to tackle corruption as it affects the lives of citizens on a daily basis. But we're also working together in some of these spaces that you were mentioning before. So let's take the example of the G20, right? When you have a meeting of G20 governments, that's a very interesting moment for us because you have a spotlight on those governments at the global level and also at home. So a lot of the work we do is around coordinating our messaging to make sure we're pushing for the same things, both at that global space. For example, when the G20 was in Hamburg last year, the Leaders Summit, we had people from our network coming to Hamburg, from the G20 member countries to actually put pressure on the governments from below, as it were, in a global space. And that is where a lot of the changes that we want to see are happening, where you have that pressure from different points in a coordinated way. So that's really part of the most interesting part of the job, I'd say.
Another development that I see in the aid sector is a lot more private sector companies stepping into the development world. Whether it be Whole Foods, Whole Planet Foundation, or whether it be Nike's Girl Effect, those kind of things. But I'm also seeing governmental organizations like USAID or DFID actually in some cases preferring to work with private partners. How does that affect transparency?
Well, that's a huge question, but I think there's a basic assumption there which is that the private sector, by definition, is going to be perhaps more transparent, and that is something that I think would be fair to perhaps question. Especially when we've seen, just to give an example, all of the OECD member countries signed up to something called the Foreign Bribery Convention in over 20 years ago now, and we looked last year at to what extent. So this means that OECD member countries will take action against their own companies when they pay bribes abroad. So linked to what you were just saying. And we found that in the majority of countries, the enforcement of that legal framework that they themselves signed up to has been, on average, moderate. So in other words, this is again pointing to the issue that there are laws in place and the gaps that need to be addressed are known, but there hasn't yet been enough action taken to actually, make the problem not go away, but at least to tackle the problem, make it more difficult to engage in corrupt action. So this is exactly one of the points that we're trying to work on.
The other big word on everyone's lips is China. And in recent years, we've seen China step into the development world, especially in countries where the Western world has reduced or even stopped their work there. How accountable are the Chinese government? How much do they adhere to transparency values?
Yeah. What's interesting there is that what's being flagged through some of these initiatives is just some of the gaps that are existing in developing countries that were there before. So if this is helping to draw attention to some of the things that have to be happening anyway, then hopefully this will also help to drive change. And the other area where China is helping to drive change is what we were talking about before, the illicit flows from the developing world to the developed world. So there's increasing concern about corrupt networks with some with a Chinese component using the global financial system to get funds out of China into the developed world, and that is a factor that's also helped to actually drive better enforcement and better standards globally, I'd say.
Oh, so it's a positive thing overall, you see?
I mean, there are huge questions here around the whole role of China. But from a global level, the fact that there is more concern about the role that China is playing is overall helping to drive more attention to these issues that were there perhaps before, right?
Obviously, a chat like this wouldn't be complete without asking you a question on how the police themselves. Mm-hmm. in a manner of speaking. How does Transparency International keep to its own vision and values, especially when you have over 100 chapters worldwide?
Well, this is absolutely a critical point. So, our own credibility when we show up and want to talk about these things is very, very important. And so we do have basically a whole team working on these areas around our own accountability, publishing reports, making sure that all our data is also public. So if you go to our website, you will find, a whole bunch of data around from our funding to our projects. For example, all of our projects or most of our projects are assessed, and some of them don't go so well. And there's a section on our website that has the evaluations of those projects, even when sometimes they are critical. So we are definitely doing all we can to try and walk our own talk and try to set standards precisely to enable us to be able to talk about this with legitimacy, right?
Understood. And just to play devil's advocate a bit more, how do you keep the balance between adhering to high transparency standards, which take time? Let's be honest, it takes a lot of time with monitoring and analysis and the correct kind of reporting, and the urgent need we find in the development world. I'm thinking of a situation like Syria, where people need help now, but because of the security situation, development agencies sometimes find themselves having to work with groups that we don't know that much about and don't have accountability. How do you find that balance?
Okay. So, Syria is an extreme example, but if we take it, like maybe one step closer to sort of the norm, there's a difference between the costs of corruption that are distributed across the whole of society and the people who benefit, which is usually a small minority. And that, I think, is the key to that question, in the sense that often you see that the people who are resisting reforms come from that small minority and who are pushing against some of the measures that need to be taken, right? So when you talk about the balance between the costs and the benefit, it's also about who's benefiting and who's paying the cost, right? So I think that's important to remember, because there are multiple examples where when corruption has been tackled, actually it's had a benefit for the citizens as a whole, right? So it's very important to remember, who's paying the cost here, right?
I got you. Max, I could talk to you all day with ease, but I wanted to wrap up this podcast by asking you, 2019, what are the hot topics, hot issues, what are the emerging areas that you find interesting? What can we look forward to?
Well, I think there's two main areas here that we're aiming to focus on in the next coming years, in the next 2 years, in fact. The first one is around what we were talking about a bit, which is, we're calling it for now just dirty money. So how does dirty money cross borders? Who is helping people to carry out those transactions? Where does the money end up? And that will be a key thematic focus for us in the next 2 years, working together with our global network of chapters. And the other one is the role of money in politics. So after the US election and various other elections in Europe also, there's growing awareness of this issue, which our chapters have been talking about for almost over a decade in some cases. We know warning about money in politics. This is an entry point for corruption, and now in the last 2 years there's started to be a lot more attention on that, and the role of the fact that in most countries it's possible to donate money to political campaigns in a largely intransparent way, and the risks that come from that. So we're definitely going to be pushing on that in the next couple of years. So hopefully you'll be seeing a lot more of that coming up.
Max, it's been fascinating talking to you. I could talk to you all day long if I could. But where can the folks at the Foreign Post podcast find out more about Transparency International?
Oh, that's quite straightforward. It's transparency.org. That's our homepage, and from there you can find links also to our national chapter work and to various, to most of the initiatives that we're carrying out are on the website right now.
So all that remains is to say thanks for speaking to Foreign Post. I hope it's been as fascinating to the folks at home as it's been for me. Guys, check out foreignpost.com to find out more about Transparency International. And until next time, have a great one.
Hey, that's Foreign Post for this week. I want to thank Transparency International and Max Heywood for being on, and of course Rue Owen for her outstanding work. Listen, for more information on Transparency International, check out www.transparency.org. And of course, for more information about international development and humanitarian assistance, find foreignpost.com every day. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. This has been a presentation of Foreign Post Media Incorporated in cooperation with Co-Create Studios, Arlington, Virginia. For more information on Co-Create Studios, please visit their website at cocreatestudios.com. The Foreign Post podcast is sponsored by Power-Based Associates. For all of your research, public affairs, and communication needs, visit powerbasedassociates.com for more information.